Let me say a word about politics and where we are, since several people asked me about it. And I feel maybe I should say it's an interesting moment. Let me say two things about politics. One, the presidential race. You all know, we all know about as much as anyone else on it. I mean, if I had to bet right now, I would bet that Romney would win. I think a reasonably close race against President Obama. But it could go either way. It's fluid. But if you look at history, incumbents usually win. So President Obama's strongest suit he has going for him is that he's an incumbent. Incumbents win about 2/3 of the time. Incumbents who do not have primary challengers win even more often. So the single best thing President Obama has going for him is that he is in office and he didn't have a primary challenge within his party. And, if you think about it, it makes sense. If you're in office, by definition, you won. And if you don't have a primary challenge, most of the people who voted for you are probably still with you. So if you got 53% last time, you probably have a reasonable shot at getting 52 or 51 maybe this time. And that would be the sort of argument that if Governor Romney doesn't run a strong campaign, if a lot of swing voters decide better the devil you know than maybe some scary Republican you don't know, that would be how Obama would win, and that's possible, I think. I think the more likely outcome is that Romney wins, because President Obama is at about 47% job approval. If you look at history, incumbent presidents usually get their job approval on election day at the ballot. It makes sense, right? If he's got the job, if you approve of the job he's doing, you're going to vote to keep him there. If you don't approve, you'll tend to vote for the alternative, for the opponent, assuming the opponent's acceptable. I don't see why Mitt Romney won't be acceptable to. I was not a huge fan of Romney. I was probably more critical of him than most conservative journalists over the last 6, 7, 8 months, but I think he's run a pretty good general election campaign in the last month, and I see no reason why he shouldn't continue to do so. He's a pretty good debater. I think he'll hold his own in the debates with President Obama. And so I think the most likely scenario is Obama, is a 47, 48%, and Romney makes the case not only to the base 45, 46% he has, but to the swing voters that it's time for a change, that he's the kind of guy who would know how to fix the economy, how to reform entitlements, how to be a stronger leader than President Obama, a more conservative leader, and that's where the public is, a little more conservative than President Obama on many issues. And I think Romney has a pretty good chance to win. I don't think it may not be the most exciting, race, and the sort of Romney's not going to be the a Chris Christie type guy having town halls and screaming and yelling at people he doesn't like, and he doesn't have Paul Ryan's kind of youthful excitement of a young leader who's just come on the scene. That one of the things that worried me a little bit about Romney, or at least bewildered me, I guess, about this year's race is here we've had this amazingly volatile politics for the last 5, 6 years. Huge mobilization behind Barack Obama in 2007, 2008, the big upset of Hillary Clinton, the victory, presidential victory for someone who had just become a senator 4 years before, first African-American president. Pretty amazing kind of moment. Then you have a huge mobilization on the other side, the Tea Party in 2009, 2010. A lot of people getting involved in politics who weren't involved in politics. Upsets in Republican primaries, huge turnover in 2010 in the House and in state houses and governorships. A huge amount of enthusiasm, energy, new people, young people, different people on both sides of the party. The one thing I assumed in 2011 is, the one thing the Republican Party is not going to do is just nominate the next in line 65-year-old white guy who ran last time and lost, which is, of course, the Republican tradition. It's a very boring party, the Republican Party. It really is ridiculous when you think about it. Reagan beat Bush Ford beat Reagan in 76, so of course the Republicans nominated Reagan in 1980. Reagan beat Bush in 80, so the Republicans nominated Bush in 88. Bush beat Dole in 88, so the Republicans nominated Dole in 96. Then in 2000, they decided to do something really wild and crazy and nominated the son of a former president, George W. Bush, who beat McCain, and then they nominated McCain in 2008. And I remember I spent all of 2011 giving speeches saying, look, it's a new era. That's the way it's been for 30 years, and it's had its good and bad aspects. We got Reagan as president, we got some admirable people as nominees, but on the whole, in this new era, in this Barack Obama era, in this Tea Party era, in this internet era, new media, post-2007-8 financial crisis, post-9/11, it's a new world. We can't possibly just do this again and nominate the next 65-year-old male who's in line for the presidency, but of course the Republican Party has done that, and maybe it's fine. Maybe people want to be reassured, and someone who has a lot of experience and isn't going to, Obama was exciting, but he didn't have much experience, and maybe it was over his head. And I think he could win, but it is one of the reasons I think it was sort of a weird last year in terms of the Republican primary. There's something a little out of sync. You would have expected a Paul Ryan or a Chris Christie type nominee, in my view. And you didn't get that, but that's fine. The one thing I'll say as a conservative and a Republican that cheers me up about the future of conservatism in America, at least, I don't know how true this is in Israel, but is the number of impressive young people who now are running, and not just running, but governing in state houses, who are in the House or in the Senate. I mean, the Republican Party, which was a party I was part of, so I'm not against it, but a party of Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush and a certain type of responsible, serious elder statesman, John McCain, is now a party of Marco Rubio and Kelly Ayotte and Paul Ryan and Chris Christie and Scott Walker and Bobby Jindal and Susana Martinez in New Mexico, and they're all impressive and they're different and don't come out of one cookie cutter. I think it's important that Romney channel that. I mean, Romney isn't that exactly, but he needs to be the spokesman in a way and the champion of a younger, reformist, forward-looking Republican Party. And my one piece of advice to him, both privately and publicly, has been to do that. Don't make it just about yourself. Make it about this whole bunch of people who are governing, in many ways, very impressively and successfully. Someone like Christie in New Jersey, for example. I do think for that reason, incidentally, a couple of things to look at just in terms of the election. I think June 5th, 2 weeks from yesterday, is the recall election in Wisconsin. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, has a goofy situation where you get 800,000 signatures and you have an early election, really, for the governor. He's running against the mayor of Milwaukee, whom he beat in November 2010 by 5 points. Walker's now ahead, it looks like, in the polls by about 5 points, somewhat to people's surprise. It looked like it was about even. If Walker wins that easily, if Walker wins it, period, certainly if he wins it by as much as he won by in 2010, that would be a big moment, I think, politically. Certainly Democrats with whom I've spoken in Washington are really worried about that outcome. It would suggest that the voters are reaffirming their decision of 2010, that in a pretty liberal state like Wisconsin, they're going to stand behind Walker as he makes some tough reforms and state pension plans and takes on the unions a little bit to try to fix the state budget situation. I think it makes Wisconsin very much a swing state in the presidential election. So I think watching what happens on June 5th will be an interesting indicator of perhaps where the country is going 6 months later. I mean, I think on the other hand, if Walker were to lose, I think it would suggest that maybe the voters have lost, aren't happy with, in a sense, what they did in 2010. They're uncertain whether that was a good idea. The campaigns against the reforms, the different governors, the campaigns against Ryan's budget and the federal level have had some effect, and the voters are having second thoughts. So I think it's a little bit of a microcosm, sort of a test in a way, for what's going to happen 6 months later. Other things will happen. It's going to be a very interesting summer. The Supreme Court will decide the constitutionality of the health care bill at the end of June. There could be all kinds of foreign policy events. Romney gets to pick a vice president. Obama can decide whether to dump Joe Biden and replace him with Hillary Clinton or not. I wrote an editorial this week telling him he should do that. Not that it's my business what he does, really, but I mean, honestly, I think he's crazy not to. I mean, if you want I said this when I wrote the piece. I did think that by writing the piece and urging him to do it, I made it less likely to happen, since they probably don't want to be taking my advice there in the Obama White House. But I do think an Obama-Clinton ticket would be stronger than an Obama-Biden ticket, but it's unlikely to happen, I think. And then there'll be 3 debates in late September or October, which 60, 70 million people will watch, which will be important. I mean, I think you'll read a million articles of super PACs, ads, this, that, Bain Capital, press stories, ridiculous stories about Romney being a mean guy when he was 15 years old at some prep school, or, Mormonism, weird religion. The New York Times is going to run that about 100 times in the next 6 months. They seem to already be working on that. I was talking with Joe Lieberman Sunday night, who was a guest at this dinner for the day school in Northern Virginia that my wife's on the board of it, the only Jewish day school in Northern Virginia, actually, which And he was really outraged by the piece. I mean, he said, can you imagine if they did that about me, sort of? How weird is it that Joe Lieberman goes to a synagogue in Washington where the men and women sit separately and where there are all these customs that look pretty odd if you're not, if you're not familiar with them, and what do they really believe? But the Times does. That happens sometimes with Jews, but the Times really cheerfully does that with Governor Romney and his religion. I don't think any of that's going to work. I think the voters will take a look at these two men in September and October and make up their mind really on policy and on which way they want the country to go. Final point, I'll just say a word about the current political state more broadly. I think one very important thing to remember as we look at politics today is it's really different from the politics we grew up with. Most of the people here who are something like my age or older, or even somewhat younger. I mean, American politics from the mid-'80s, I would say, to the middle of the last decade, so let's say 86 to about 2006, it was very exciting at the time, it was very turbulent, lots of stuff happened, but in a certain way, when you step back, it was pretty stable. Policies didn't change that much once the early Reagan sort of reforms got locked in. Clinton was Bush continued the Reagan stuff in a moderate way. Clinton was a pretty moderate Democrat, especially after the first 2 years. Second President Bush, despite all the drama, especially with foreign policy, certainly domestic policy was pretty moderate, actually. Signed a moderate education bill, expanded Medicare. Even in foreign policy, at first, after 9/11, there was big bipartisan consensus on most things. So we actually had a politics that was mostly fought between the 40-yard lines, if you want to use that metaphor, and policies that didn't diverge that much from administration to administration. That really has changed. Especially in politics, the Democrats won a huge victory in 2006, another huge victory in 2008. The Republicans won a huge victory in reverse in 2010. That pattern has not happened in 70, 80 years in American politics. This kind of wave election after wave election. The degree, if you could buy can't you do this in the stock market? You can buy a volatility index. If you could buy a volatility index in American politics, you would have lost a lot of money betting on volatility in the 90s and in the first part of the last decade. I mean, if you went from election to election, there was very little change. Incumbents won. Maybe 5 seats would change in the House. It was sort of steady. Now we have these huge changes every 2 years. And the same is true in policy. If you look at the scope of the policy reforms that are being pushed in either direction, Obamacare and the stimulus on the one hand, the Ryan budget on the other, the variance is so much greater than it was for most of the 90s, let's say, when people were arguing about should we tweak the tax code this way or that way, or slightly increase, would the highway bill be a $280 billion bill or a $310 billion bill? So we're at a very interesting moment politically, very volatile, very unpredictable, big choices ahead. Not a little scary moment in the sense that, it'd be good if the public gets these choices right. And if we get them wrong, we could have some real serious consequences. But in a way, a healthy moment for a democracy. You do want to confront these choices. You don't want to just put them down, kick them down the road. And these are real choices. And actually, a lot of political leaders, I think, are emerging to try to deal with them. So the lesson I take from this, though, is it's extremely hard to predict what's going to happen. And it's extremely hard to even assume that things look 3 or 6 months from now the way they do today. And I think the same is true of the world. We grew up in a Cold War world. It was dangerous, but pretty predictable. Pretty stable in its dangerousness, in terms of who was aligned on what side. That was succeeded by the 90s, where we had a kind of false, holiday from history, where it looked like dangers were going away. There was Oslo. There was peace everywhere, allegedly. It looked like we could forget about foreign policy for a while. We were awakened from the 90s, and tragically on 9/11. And now we're in a very volatile and uncertain world. Great dangers, obviously. Great opportunities. The so-called Arab Spring, which is a very mixed bag, but it probably is ultimately something that had to happen and does have great opportunities. The future of China could be a great thing for the world. If China could become a prosperous and reasonably free and peaceful country, it would be an unbelievable success of world history. If that East Asia, China and India, 2 billion people are, live a decent life and in peace and aren't a threat to the neighbors or to us. Or you could imagine, huge problems with the rising China. And of course, the Middle East is its own world, and there the volatility has increased a huge amount, though, in the last 3-4 years. I remember once talking to an Israeli general. I was on the whole on the side of you had to sort of shake up the Arab world. You just couldn't live with it anymore after 9/11. And I was for the war in Iraq and for other things. And I remember talking to a very distinguished Israeli general and saying, look, he was saying it's too dangerous. You're going to shake things up and you don't know how it's going to come out. You'll end up with the Muslim. And he was not foolish. You'll end up with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. You'll end up with worse situations in some of these countries. It's bad now with Saddam Hussein and with even Egypt and with Assad and Saudi Arabia, but it's manageable. And you're risking making it worse. And I remember saying, well, that's true, but I still think we don't, I think it's going to happen anyway. And B, I don't think we have much choice. I said, really? I mean, you can't just go on like this what are you going to do? Have the son of Mubarak's going to rule for the next 25 years in Egypt, and the son of Assad's going to rule for the next 25 years in Syria, and the next generation of the Saudi royal family is going to rule for the next 25 years in Saudi Arabia. It's not possible. And he looked to me and said, why not? It's a very Israeli, attitude. Well, it didn't happen anyway. Well, it's not going to happen in some of those countries, and whether for good or bad. But it does mean that if you put together the volatility and fluidity and unpredictability of world politics, and for us, I'd say, especially with respect to Israel and the Middle East, I don't consider Iran getting nuclear weapons, etc., and the volatility and fluidity and unpredictability of U.S. politics, in terms of fundamental attitudes on important issues, it's really an unusual moment. It's a different moment than the kind of world and country we're used to operating in politically. It has real challenges and real opportunities. So it's not an unhealthy thing, I think. We have to go through this every now and then to kind of reset in a way for new circumstances in a new world. But to bring this to a close, I would say it mean for those who are interested in politics and public policy, interested in our case in helping to support the state of Israel and Zionism and the well-being of the Jewish people around the world, it's a particularly important time to be involved. And David told me not to. I'm not going to make a particular pitch for Allgemeiner as opposed to anything else. Though of course you should be loyal supporters, but I would just say this generally, honestly. I've been around politics for quite a long time, and you always tell people, be involved, make a difference. Some of the time it doesn't matter that much. There were times in the 80s and 90s, things were kind of on autopilot. There were people in Congress who were powerful. They were going to be the same people there 3 years from now. People were doing their job in Washington well, and AIPAC was doing a good job, and people had their views about the world. And you could get involved, but ultimately the differences were pretty slim. The train was on the tracks, and it was going whatever direction it was going. And that's not just true of Israel. That's true of public policy in general, I would say. This is not that kind of moment. This is a moment where really, if you care about the future, people really can make a big difference, because it's such a fluid and malleable environment. And things can get a lot worse, and things can get a lot better. And they can get a lot worse and a lot better very quickly, incidentally, in this new world we live in. So whatever issue you care about, whatever organizations you choose to work with, or candidates, or causes, or intellectual efforts you choose to be involved in, I think this really is a moment to try to do as much as you can for whatever it is you believe in, because it's really not a moment where you can just step back and say things are kind of going to take care of themselves. It's really an unusual moment, and this is a great democracy, and one of the great privileges of living in the U.S., as in Israel, is you do have a chance to help shape the future. So I think this is an awfully good moment to do so. Thank you.